the Norwegian method.
I'm Olav Aleksander, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Eden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome back to the Norwegian Method podcast. We are rolling with season 3, and as people might know, we're doing sort of 2 streams in our season 3. We have a stream with Christian and Gustav, and we have a stream, of course, with Olav, man who season 1 was from. So we've heard a little bit from you recently, Olav, but it's great to have you back on the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about annual training plans. And I think, I went back and listened to series 1, and I were direct listeners to series 1 or season 1, where we talked about specifically the episodes planning and training, and then Norwegian method training, where we sort of talked a bit about planning and then a bit about training itself. And I wanted to go in a little bit deeper on some of the concepts we touched there, respond to some questions we had, and perhaps sort of try and take it a little bit further in general. So that's kind of framing up this episode for the week. Just welcome back. Thanks for spending your time with us again, Olav. And let's start with, when you're starting an annual training plan, do you plan in a year, or is it rolling for you because you have so much, is it kind of like rolling year, or is it, no, this is a calendar year, we're going to plan for this? And how do you think about that?
I would say it depends a little bit on sport and how certain your calendar is. If the calendar is very uncertain, then I would maybe go a little bit more rolling, but still I would try to create an annual plan, let's say, beforehand. The main reason for that is because if I don't set some expectations, or let's say have an idea of what I'm going to develop this year, it's also then very hard to go back and learn from basically how to optimize it also. So if it's just a rolling plan and you go by month or something like that, I have to try to think, okay, this is what we've done previous years, and this is how it's been growing over the previous years. I think that this year, for example, we can do this much, or we can do this different, for example. And that means that when I already do that, then I'm already creating an expectation a little bit for what is the annual plan gonna be. And the reason, again, for why that's important is that when I then start to build the plan and we start to execute on the plan, I can start to measure the gap a little bit between what have we planned and how are we progressing according to that plan. And that gives me learning. That gives me an opportunity to look at, okay, I thought this, but I have to adjust a little bit more like this. And these are the important steps then to learn from, and then feed into the plan again next year. Like, where I'm too optimistic, where I undershooting, did unexpected things come up that I should have foreseen, or basically is the changes that I have to make in the plan things that are outside of our control, for example. So that's I would say I start with an annual plan always.
Okay. And we touched on, sort of what that looks like. So it's end goal, we reverse engineer from the end goal and go backwards. So that's stuff we touched on in season 1. What I wanted to touch on here, and it's actually something you mentioned, is when things don't go to plan, do you build that into the plan? Do you say, listen, I think we can achieve X in 9 months, but there's a very likely scenario that we're going to have a setback for whatever reason, extra travel, extra partner requirements, injury. So I'm going to build in and say, listen, let's plan for 8 months, or let's plan for, a month of lost time or something like this.
Again, depending on how crazy the target is. So obviously, if you really, really want to go for a crazy target, you might, or I might compromise, or trying to build in more things going on the rails but there's a higher risk that it might not go that way. And that's the consequence of setting like very, very ambitious goals. But I think also at the same time, then a little bit depending on what, let's say if you are the current champion and this is what you think is required, or you want to do something to get there, then I think it feels like a failure if you fail on that one. But if you are, let's say, a challenger, then basically we also have to be open that even if you don't reach your goal, you most likely with a very good plan have still had quite decent development. And that is the important part of it, is as long as we develop, as long as we learn, as long as we develop, at some point, if just focusing on yourself and you develop, you will be the fastest in the world, like theoretically speaking, to put it that way. There's a certain limit to how much people can really improve, where you come to probably what is peak human performance, and then those people that are already up there are much less room for them to improve on, while the people that are growing, as long as they are growing, they are eventually getting there. And so risk and redundancy, yes, I do normally advocate for this. You should, after you've been working, in the beginning when you start working with somebody, then you don't know necessarily, because it's still a learning process. You need to figure out how things are. You can take learnings from history, but we also have to be realistic about it. There are so much we can capture by data, and then there is even more context that we're not able to capture by data. And we know that our memory are not the long-term memory of humans, are also in these days of AI actually also susceptible for hallucinations when we try to think retrospectively. So as you go and you learn an athlete to better know, and you work over years, you also start to know more what are the risks and how do I factor this into a plan, and what kind of mitigating actions do I need there to work around that. Yeah. So I would normally say yes, I do build redundancy and risks into my plans.
And you talked about susceptibility there in terms of the athletes, right? So is that something you look at individually? You say, listen, so Gustav's a good example these days. He's had an Achilles injury. So are you a little bit more cautious with the planning on the run and building in some redundancy for potential progress there, or would you do that anyway? And his specific scenario is not as relevant as a general scenario of building redundancy in.
I think one of the reasons for why we've had so little injuries, so little sicknesses normally over the last decade in our program is because we have normally divided the year into, let's say, a capacity part and then a specificity part. And then also in the capacity part, things have been more, call it, internally controlled rather than externally controlled. And what I mean by that is, for example, velocity or speed, power. These are components that are external load, or let's say external factors that you go by. So you set a certain power target, or you set a certain velocity target or speed target, depending on what you're doing, or which kind of instrument you're using in order to control your intervals. But the internal part is more where you go either by heart rate, you go by feel, you go by lactate, you go by VO2, you go by SMO2, these kind of things. And very often there, for example, let's say if you were using heart rate, the benefit of using heart rate is that this also factors in other stressors as well, for example. So let's say that you end up with a little bit, just use a very, or to use one example, let's say that you one day end up with poor form. So you go out and running, then it will normally cost you more to go by the same power, and this would be reflected, for example, in higher heart rate, or if there are other things going on, it will be reflected in high heart rate. So if you control it not by heart rate, your power have to be lower. Has to be lower. So you factor in, let's say, stress, let's say, partially into the equation by using heart rate. While if you rather go by power, this is where you just now add more stress to it. So if you already have other factors there, so let's say that you have a little bit poor form that day, you're a little bit tired, there are other things that are going on, you would just see that the heart rate now becomes higher than what you would normally expect for the same power. And a good way to balance this is exactly that. You have to take into account internal factors that are going in your body. You have to develop or calibrate a good sense for intensity control internally. So when using instruments, I think we've talked about this several times before, but when you're using instruments, the whole point with that is that it's not like that is the fact, that's how it should, like you should go. It's a way of calibrating, continuously calibrating your body. I like to use the analogy of GPS or GNSS systems and an inertial navigation systems. Inertial navigation systems are the most accurate or precise down to the millimeter, micromillimeter navigation system that we have. But they are very susceptible to drift. So if they don't get an external input telling them exactly where they are, suddenly, even though they are sitting on the same place place. They will suddenly just say that no, I'm moving, while in fact they don't do. But that's why you need an external input, like for example, then or an objective metric like a global navigation satellite system, like a GPS, that feeds in saying, no, you are here, you are here, you are here. So you get that by frequent. But then we also know that the problem with the GPS is that's not that accurate. It's a little bit more like moving around all the time. So even if you're standing at the same spot, you start your GPS, you will be able, if you zoom into your location, you see that it starts to move around, but no, I was standing still. But you see that the GPS is moving around by half a meter back and forth like this, almost like we call like a dog on a leash. But you have the dog on the leash there. But since the INS is so fine-tuned, it will sense that no, I'm not moving half a meter. I'm basically here. So these two combined is really the power of the most, let's say, the most accurate navigation systems we have in the world today. And that's how I see it as well. The INS is the body, that's our feeling in this kind of thing. But if we don't get external input for, let's say, from lactate or VO2 or SMO2 and so on, power, then we won't know, and we will start to drift. And some athletes, actually a little bit funny, if you look at Christian and Gustav, at least back, is that typically if we didn't do a lot of measurements in a period, Christian typically ended up erring on, let's say, higher in intensities, thinking was the same intensity, while Gustav actually won otherwise. He went up being a little bit more cautious, a little bit more cautious, erring a little bit on the, let's say, easier intensities, still thinking it's the same intensity. So So again, how do we avoid injuries, or how do we mitigate these risks? By normally, we are very conscious about what tools we use when and how we periodicize the training exactly to encompass this better. And we don't use heart rate is obviously, or is influenced by several other factors, and that's why I like normally to reduce it rather to lactate or SMO2, because then yes, you have to be conscious about your feelings and other things, maybe you slept bad and so on. But when you first go out and you decide on doing a session, you would evaluate it normally by lactate or SMO2 to control your intensity, and then that dictates more the power. Put it that way.
Yep. And that links to portions of the season that would be traditionally called something like a pre-season, off-season, or base building, where you're working more on capacity, and then that sort of sharpening race specificity aspect when you're closer to race day, right? So that's kind of how you'd split the year in halves. Would you split that? So is that something you do for each cycle towards each major race, each peaking, or would you do that across more of a year and say, like, listen, the first race of the year, we're going to be going in heavy and no one really cares?
That's you could say that depending on how many races there are and how important the races are, this will dictate, let's say, how much specificity that is brought into the program. Obviously, with building capacity, you're trying to encompass also the specificity as well. But let's say the real race demands and this kind of thing, that block, it will will be bigger leading into very important races, while it's shorter, or even to the point where you wouldn't. I would say that I wouldn't. I know that some people really like to do racing, and they think like racing is an important aspect, very important aspect of the training concept moving forward. But I think too much racing is not good either, especially the closer you get to peak human performance, because you're not able to be equally specific on, let's say, the needs or let's say building capacity by just doing a lot of racing. Some racing you need to do because you need to get a feel for, okay, where are we compared to where we would like to go. But the longer you're away from the important race of your year, or let's say 2 important races you are of a year, depending on how many A races do you put into your calendar, that would dictate let's say, how long the specificity block. Like if you go into a race and you only go there by capacity, you haven't done anything specific and so on, then the question would always be like, what are you hoping to learn? You can obviously learn something, just see, okay, how far am I away from where I would expect to be? And that would then dictate somewhat the content of what you're going to build in moving forward, to get in more the specificity, to bridge that gap between where you just went in and just did racing straight off capacity, and and what you saw was the demand in the race there, if it's relevant for your A race, to put it that way.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why you want to have a VO2 master, because when athletes or customers comes there and they are doing the training, they're putting in money and hours into improving the fitness, you want to have a device that basically allows you to track their progress, but also measuring their metabolic power as well. And then on top of that, the only way to truly be able to do individualization is also to measure the utilization of the athletes. And there is probably no better device on the market to do that with than, for example, the VO2 master.
If you've been thinking about adding VO2 testing to your training facility, you know our viewers get an exclusive one-on-one consultation with their product experts on how to make VO2 Master work for you. Head to vo2master.com/Norwegian-method to book yours today, or follow the link in our show notes.
The Norwegian method.
Well, this is sort of in and around some of the questions I want to ask, so I'm glad you went there. So if you can only race once a year, right, or peak once a year, how are you tracking progress? Is it just about training efforts? Because surely training maximum effort in training is not going to be what it is in a race, right? There are other factors that will allow you to compete, like sort of go to a different place in a race. So how do you track that progress if you're only going to race once a year, say, or infrequently perhaps?
There are many ways to do this. I'm not a very big fan of brute force testing myself, but you could argue that that's probably in the end the gold standard, like purely from a testing perspective, aside from racing itself. And what I mean by brute force testing is where you for example, you go out at a couple of different velocities or different power outputs, for example, and then you just see how long can you keep that until you basically are not able to, let's say, keep that up anymore, or even remobilizing and getting back up there. You're basically just purely is raw fatigue, onset of raw fatigue thereon. That gives probably or arguably the best way of assessing capacity, you could say. There are always nuances to that as well, like how motivated were you really when you did it and all these kind of things as well. So nothing is truly perfect in the end. But how I like more to do it is to take it as a part of the training. And the good thing then, if you use really good methods for assessing the internal system, or let's say the supply side of it, how much energy is going into the system now to do a certain effort, that would then give a very good indication of what is happening as you basically move along. How quickly is the different systems responding? So, for example, if you know that you need to bring up the utilization because you are converting from a shorter race to a longer race, for example, how do we see that utilization is moving up now? Do we need to maybe increase the stimulus a little bit for that? Because the utilization, let's say that we said, okay, when we do an Ironman, just to throw out a number, let's say that we said, okay, we need to be at least 90% of your VO2 max going into to an Ironman. Then if that it was at 85%, for example, because we had been racing more like half Ironmans, for example, and I had 3 months, obviously then I would need to be there, not at race day at 90%. I would like to be there a little bit before at 90%, for example. So now in the training, obviously then I can assess a little bit what's happening with utilization now. If I see that, this is progressing a little bit slower than what I would expect to be from last week, or let's say from last month to this month and so on, or from week to week, even seeing progress there. Then I would say, hey, we need to redistribute a little bit the training load here now to try to increase the stimulus to move this a little bit faster and then you just have to continue to assess it, because it doesn't mean necessarily that works, but this is the way that you have to work in the end. You don't have any answers up front. You can only apply best practices and science, let's say a very systematic way to move this forward. So that would be the way I would be looking at it. If I only were peaking for one race a year, you leave more to chances, because in the end, it's not a pure time trial. No race is a pure time trial. Let's say most races are, especially in triathlon, they are depending on race dynamics. Kona was a brilliant example of that, where you see that people end up racing very differently than what they've done in previous races before. and you can say the parts of your strategy obviously should be built on what likely scenarios are going to be playing out, and you hope that based on past experiences and knowing your competitors, at least let's say what you would say is good enough, you would be able to say that, well, this guy's capacity is this guy's capacity is this guy's racing style is this, and this guy's racing style is like this. And these are the likely scenarios that could play out, and then factoring obviously that the World Championships often, in the same way as Olympic Championships, plays out differently than other races, because people are more protective with their strategy and they want to maybe pull out, let's say, their aces in that A race. So peaking for one race a year only leaves two risks. One, you don't know necessarily how you stack up 100% against the field you're going to race with. So I would say trying to target maybe one race where you know they are, so you at least get a very good feel for where are they. And the second part is that you also leave a risk with if you only peak once a year, is that how do you know that your peaking strategy really is working well as well? So peaking is obviously a part of the game too. So let's say know how much time you really need to peak, how you build in peaking into your program or tapering into a race, so that you really bring out your best performance on race day. And that is also something that you can't go by the playbook. You can go by the playbook or best practice the first time, but obviously that's in the same way as everything else. It is a little bit where you need to systematically trial and error a little bit to see whether you're able to build it up. And I can say athletes do need different kinds of peaking, because they are different, both psychologically and physiologically, meaning that what brings out the best on race day is never necessarily the 100% the same program for them.
Yeah. Wanted to touch on a couple of things there. I mean, as an example of race dynamics, I know Christian and Gustav, well, more so Christian, was talking about pre-Kona that he thought the bike was going to be very surgy because of things like Race Ranger. And I think we saw that play out when he pulled out and had to follow Magnus. Like, I think that's a great example of having to put down big power for a small period of time, as he sort of suggested. You talked there about, as an example, you used extraction and saying, is it tracking the way we think? Just to clarify or crystallize this for listeners, you're basically talking about, say a capacity phase, you would be tracking progress via looking at external work done for the internal metrics you're using as rate limiters or as prescriptors, and then vice versa in a peaking phase where you are using external loads, right? You're using race pace, race power. You would then track progression via maybe changes in capacity in terms of pure output. Can you do that for longer? Or are we progressing? And or an internal metric at that point. Is your heart rate reducing or is your lactate lower for the same output? Right? That's roughly what you're saying?
A little bit depending on how stable your conditions are. And the danger, of course, with getting into the details is that when you play around with this for 1.5 decades, then you don't only know what's going on in the body, but also you know the strength and weakness of the measurement methods, but you also know the strength and weakness of the technologies as well, and how it is influenced also, because there are plenty of things we measure in the body which we don't measure. We don't measure the cause, we measure the effect of something. Mm-hmm. That's one, and we also maybe don't measure it at the source. We actually measure it quite a bit downstream from where it's actually happening in the body too. Yes, I would say that the gold standard to assess this is, for example, when we are using the VO2 master. So you would say that one, you would be looking at the gross efficiency of an athlete. How is this basically changing a little bit throughout, let's say, that's one. But more importantly, important for an Ironman versus shorter races is to have a very high utilization. So you would need to basically quantify, for example, the VO2 max versus, for example, their utilization at race pace, or let's say the utilization at maximum metabolic steady state, for example. And that gives you a very clear picture of, okay, how are things moving now compared to that? Because in the end, what you can do for short duration, it puts a completely different demand on your body than what you can do for a long duration. And we also the difficult part or the complex part with Ironman is that you don't do Ironman training every day. You do it isolated and put into pieces and bits and pieces. and it's never the load that you do in a race. So in contrary to, for example, an Olympic distance triathlon or a sprint distance triathlon, where you would basically encompass all distances in your training every day, more or less, and the only thing that maybe the intensity is you even go higher, but you bridge it up into basically intervals instead. Yeah, so it's not 100%, but you would encompass it more or less every day. That's the same thing also with track and field, with swimming, many of these kind of sports as well. The distance that these athletes does compared to what they do in competition are basically encompassing what they do in a race multiple times in a training session. While when you go to the ultra events, like for example Ironman, you don't do it. You are at the point where basically you are trying to get close to something there or simulate something there, but it's never a real simulation or never an encompassment before you actually do it on race day itself that gives you really the answer how things are.
Yeah, no, that's a really astute observation. I think we touched on a little bit before that the bizarre nature of specifically in ultra running, that you do a lot of your racing at intensities that are much lower than the majority of your training. So that it's an idiosyncratic nature of events that take that long. You just can't replicate the event in training, unfortunately.
Yeah, the duration is much shorter than what you do. Yeah, so that's also the same thing. Like I think we used this as before, because if you take Christian in how say the power output or the pace he's swimming or the power output or the running that he does, and let's say that you targeted Ironman specific marathon running, for example. So let's say you decided to run 30K. So let's say you run 30K now at your let's say the target pace you are aiming to go by. If you ask Christian how he feels now when he's halfway into this session, he would maybe say, this feels like a 5 or 6 or something like that. Towards the end of the session, maybe he says like it's a 7 or something like this. Now he's starting to get fatigued. Ask him in a race when he had been swimming and biking before he does the running. It's a flat out. It's a 10. And I think the videos that were from for example in Kona 2022, for example, shows how exhausted and he was, but also with what kind of core temperature you come in at the end of it, and you don't have that. You don't have that on a training day. So it means basically again that Ironman is a different beast than most other things, simply because it is a place where you don't encompass what you do in a race in training situation, and that actually is the normal thing for most elite athletes. They do the distance they do in racing multiple times over, almost every day in their training of what they do in racing.
Yeah. So you've touched on a few things that really dovetail nicely here. So one of the things we touched on is race frequency. We talked about, single peak has its risks. It's probably not ideal. Talked about multiple peaks being, or rather, frequency of racing being a challenge in terms of race specificity. So how do you think about selecting race frequency? Is there an optimal? How do you think about it? Obviously, this changes across an athlete's career and their goals, right? If you only have to validate and then race Kona, that's very different to you need to qualify and we need to get you some race experience since your first year as a pro. But those factors aside, if we can, the specifics of the athlete, but how do you think about race frequency?
Race frequency again depends on the needs, I would say. For an elite athlete where you have won races, so let's say for Christian and Gustav as an example, then I think that you can bring down the race frequency quite a bit, because you know what it takes to win. And as long as you keep you do racing, nothing massive is going to change normally from basically over a half year's time. So if you race 2 times a year, for example, that's what you do. There's not going to be some like a massive. They do happen. Cozumel was a good example of that when Christian did his first race. Obviously, that is suddenly where it becomes like a shock. But in most cases, I think, and especially the closer you get to really to peak human performance, the smaller these kind of nuances will be. So it's more like you need to do a little bit of racing, but you can keep it to very few races. You know what it takes physiologically, you know what it takes psychologically to do these kind of races. For athletes that might have a really, like, they're producing massive numbers, super strong, and let's say on paper, it's almost like you're surprised they are getting fairly down on the list. I would maybe wonder, okay, where are they mentally when they're racing? And maybe you figure out that actually, yeah, I'm stressing out, I'm making poor choices in the race situation. Then I would say that, hey, that's what you need to prioritize into your plan. You need actually to do more racing and actually come to a place where you start to get more comfortable. You trust more in your own strategy, and you are even to the point where you have clear goals for what kind of strategy you want to test out a little bit to get different to get experiences. And this is a part of building towards the becoming a world champion. And I think here also it's easy maybe to get too impatient when you get really close there. You just said, I just have to do it one more time or something like this, and you stop being systematic, or let's say you become not so systematic. Especially since we're talking about psychology, which seems to be a very muddy or gray area. It's less tangible. But I would say that this time it is even more important to be systematic in the process, and where you just have to accept that it's going to take time. Pareto rule. It takes 20% to get to 80% of the results, and then the last 20% is going to take 80% of the effort. But we can also say that basically putting it a little bit on the edge, it takes 1% to get to the 99%, and it takes the last percent takes 99% effort. It's just a matter of how close are you really to becoming the world champion when it comes to details and so on. And here I think that it's easy sometimes to underestimate how important many of these basic things are, and one end up choosing or chasing the quick fixes on magic tricks that don't exist, instead of just trying to do things just a little bit better and accept it's going to take it's going to take longer time to make progress the closer you get to world championship level. So again, how much racing should you do during a year depends, I would say, how confident you are, let's say, in your ability to win a race. And then I think that, okay, if you don't win races and you're confident you still would win races, maybe you are overconfident that you reassess a little bit the things there. If you already are a world champion and you are winning races and you know what it takes to data, well, then you could probably do less races here and focus exactly on really building the last very bits that you would lose when you start traveling, doing races, recovery, and other things that are there. So again, it comes down a little bit to your demand, but don't underestimate the importance of having almost periodizing psychology and building almost sessions or other things where targeting psychology doesn't need a psychologist. Psychology only means basically that you are more also looking a little bit on your own strategy. How do I put myself in an environment where I can test out the things that stresses me psychologically, and actually start to practice them and work on them in a structured manner. And you can think of this almost like interval building, where you do it as a part, you build it in almost as intervals in your training, or workouts into your training, or you do racing exactly to practice things that you feel are holding you back to really get out your full physiological potential.
Yeah, I think people underestimate the skill or the craft of triathlon and overemphasize perhaps the physiology of it. The physiology is obviously the bedrock on which everything exists, but you need to execute on race day, and you will not be able to put out the powers and the whatevers if you are not in the group, and you won't be in the group if you don't know how to transition properly. We saw people struggling to take wetsuits off at certain times. We saw people, do shoes come on quickly? Do I put my socks on? When am I doing that? All those stressing factors. When do I rack my bike? How stressful is that? All these things that you just need to get comfortable with. And I can't remember exactly which race it was. It was his T100 that Christian did, and he didn't actually know the course. And he was so comfortable. I think he still won it, or he did very well in it. And he was like, yeah, I didn't even know the course. And that speaks to how relaxed he is around racing and how confident he is in his ability to just go out and execute in that. And that takes time as well. I think we tend to see, we tend to look at Christian and Gustav as fully formed athletes when they started winning races, and we miss the previous Olympic cycles, right? And all that racing they did to get to the previous Olympics. We tend to forget that when in actual fact they'd spent the best part of a decade developing in racecraft, right? And then now the physiology gets layered on top of that again. Now all of a sudden they look like, it's the overnight success that took decades to make. So yeah, I think that race tactics, all those things are super important to people, especially even age groupers. You talked last season in the swimming episode, we talked about getting out into water and getting used to swimming in a pack in the open water and being swum over. And I think something like that's a perfect example of it. Is, everyone spends their life in a pool cutting laps and doing their thing and pushing off the wall every 50 meters, when in actual fact getting swum over is completely different, and swimming around buoys and sighting and all those things. So
but I think just add to that as well. I think here also, like, if there are seldom somebody being so dominant there that they are winning every race that is there. I think this is something that we were very strategic, and we saw opportunity to disrupt, let's say, the Ironman world, first Olympic, but then the Ironman world. But then eventually people catch up as well, and we've been very open and sharing whatever we do as well, and a little bit to make sure that we don't get too comfortable with what we do. But then someday you also stop winning as well, and that can sometimes freak people out as well, or they get very suddenly uncertain, like what changed now? You don't necessarily understand it, and this is starting to take energy from yours as well. And then I think exactly this is the place where you just have to put yourself a little bit back into the challenger mode again, and thinking, okay, how do I now actually have? Because if you start looking to your past and just looking to find back something that was in the past, well, it's not the past anymore. It's the present, and the present is different than the past is, and that means that you maybe have to go into a learning mode again and do this again. But this is sometimes that I've seen so many times throughout in different sports, where people stresses out and it basically becomes the end of their career, more or less. Yes, they do good and these kind of things, but some are able to bounce back, and they are really good at basically reintroducing or taking the position of being the challenger again, and being very structured and focused, and don't just getting distracted by what others do, and let's say improving their strategy again to bounce back. But then you have those that basically they are just trying to recreate the past, and it's they continue to be good, but they are not the champions anymore.
Yeah, there's a saying that no man walks to the same river twice, because the man has changed and so has the river. Perhaps it's no man walks to the same river of lactate twice, but the thing here is you need to go back to basics, make sure the fundamentals are correct, and ensure that you're doing what you did to get there to some degree, but your body's changed, and so is the racing, and so are the competitors. So you sort of need to. There's a term that I've heard talked about in in and around the Norwegian sports sciences of intelligent failures. And I think that's a really good way to think about this. Is like let's make intelligent experiments and be happy to fail with them. Right? We need to evolve, but at the same time, we may not. You can't wholesale change everything. You can't throw out intensity control because all of a sudden, I need to go faster because I'm not winning anymore. Some of the principles need to remain.
The Norwegian method.
The reason why I use Morten with the boys is because it reduces the GI stress. And the reason why it reduces the GI stress is basically because carbohydrates are packed in a hydrogel. And why that is important again is because if you can then take more carbohydrates per time, it means basically also you can train faster or race faster, which ultimately is the goal in our sport.
To benefit from the one-time code and get 20% off your next purchase on Morten.com, simply enter the code TNMS1 at checkout. The code is applicable once per customer on all products except the Morten bicarb system, valid until the 31st of December 2025.
The Norwegian method.
We talked a bit about peaking. I want to touch on this again. So if we're using two peaks, right? If we're going to use a 2-peak structure, which is a lot of what people will be doing, right? So we can talk about, they may need more racecraft and they may throw in a couple more races to learn racecraft. They may not need a peak for them. But if we're using 2 peaks, we're using a world championship and we're using a key qualifier, perhaps. Where would you want to put that key qualifier with respect to the world championship? And we don't have to talk about Kona specifically. We can just talk about if that is month 12, where does the qualifier sit? Is it at 6 months? Do you want to be a full capacity phase shut and then a specificity, do the race and then go again and use it as a half-year block? Or would you prefer to push that closer to the and do a longer capacity block initially and have that qualifier race closer to the championship?
I think it depends a little bit on how much variation there are in the scenarios that you are gonna see in a race. If you feel more confident, again, if you're world champion, like we talked about, and it's more like you are racing every half year or whatever, you are in the field with the same competitors that are there, and you keep fairly current with what is changing or how things are moving there. Then I think that you can move this closer to your race day. So you use it more like really you're building up, testing your peaking strategy and so on. But you still leave enough room that if you need to make adjustments, you have room to make those adjustments again. But we are talking now about adjustments. If you're more uncertain about your strategies, you're still, let's say you're in a developing phase and it's more about learning, you expect maybe there will be larger changes to your program, then I would push it earlier, let's say more space in between that. So it gives more space also for making adjustments, adjusting both capacity, how you build capacity, but also how you then give more room for both the race specificity and tapering period as well going in there. But you can't change too many variables. It just means that you're still sticking to a couple of things that you decide, okay, these are the most important places to build on. But you just said I might be more off, and I might need more time to really make the necessary changes to those few or one single variable or characteristic that you have set it. This is what we are very uncertain about, and we need to test it. And that gives a little bit how close or how far away. I would normally say that if the race day is month 12, probably 3 months out, 3 to 4 months out is where I would put it for an elite potentially. 3 months out, maybe even 2 months out. Again, depending on how confident you are in your strategy. If you're less confident, I would probably say that any more than 6 months, basically splitting in half a year, makes no sense, because it would be basically be just restarting the whole process all over again and then building towards the end there because you have moved it that far. So between 2 to 4 months is probably where I would. I don't think if you need more than 4 months, then I think that you are probably in such early development stage anyway that, okay, if it was 6 months or 4 months, then
Yep.
That's not what's really going to make the difference. But I would say that if the goal point is a qualifier, and then it's your A race, so this is a B race versus A race, for example, then more than 4 months, I'm not sure if it really would make any sense at all.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. That's super helpful. I think people get a lot out of that. So we did touch on previously sort of strengths and weaknesses and how we think about those in previous season. Again, those episodes are highlighted at the beginning of this episode. I guess, how do you address them at different times of the year? Is it as simple as weaknesses get addressed in a capacity phase and then strengths get emphasized in our specificity phase? Or is it more complicated than that? And how much are you apportioning time to those? Like how different do those programs look, I guess, from if we're trying to develop strengths or weaknesses? What are the proportion differences?
Yeah, so very systematic approach I would preach is that, first of all, you need to sit down and you need to decide on what's your goal for the season. And a goal for season means basically you need to set a date and you will need to set what is your target. The target doesn't have to be winning a race. It can be equally much that you say that I'm going to be 10th place in a race, for example. That's what you're targeting because that's what you feel is realistic. Or you basically just move it completely away from something that is external, and you just say that I want to improve this much, for example, on it, so that You do your racing, you race your way, and you just say that last year I did this in this race, this time in the race. This year I want to improve my time by 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, depending on where you are. When you have done that and you set the targets, and it's important, two things are important. You need to set a target, a very specific target, and then a target. So that means basically what's your goal time, and what is the event? What kind of event? Like what kind of race type is it? Second part is where you you could say that basically that's you just need to set a very specific goal, date and goal time you could set for a certain event. Then when you have done that, that's where you can start to break it down into requirements. That means, okay, how do I need to raise this in order to get there, or to be able to do that? And then gives the requirement that is that. So you set a goal, you set the requirement. Now the next step is to do a gap analysis and make this as simple as possible. I would say take three to six characteristics. I normally do 6 characteristics. Where you basically said, okay, I need, in order to do this, I have to have this kind of capacity. So I have to be able to do this in training, for example. So I have to do this, be able to do this power for this duration, for example, or this pace for this swimming, and it cannot leave me exhausted, for example. So I have to be able to do it. Or you said it just a fair bit higher. So you have to be able to do that in your training. It can be that I need to be able to do, let's say, this kind of specificity, so surges or whatever. I have to. It can be tactically, it can be like you just have to decide on, if I'm going to describe what it would take as the 6 months. Obviously, there can be, you can choose 200 different characteristics or thousands or 50 or whatever you want to do. But the point is to make it tangible. You need to make it tangible, because the next step for you, when you have defined these characteristics and you looked at where do I stand today versus where do I need to be on race day, that gives you 2 things. How much time you got to work on these characteristics, and also how big are the different gaps in those, let's say 5 characteristics or whatever that is there. And now when you have that, the next step is to understand how much time will these different characteristics takes to develop, or how much time do we know that it takes to develop these different characteristics. So let's say that you need to improve your raise power by 5%. Then you can already probably say, okay, if I'm going to increase my power by this much, you will say, okay, likely I'm going to need 6 months to do that. Well, that already, and if you see then that there's a big, to be able to reach your target, this has a high priority, because they say the gap is big. You define this as one of the biggest gaps when you look at the requirements and where you stand compared to those requirements today. Then this would give also, where do you need to prioritize this in your periodization as well, or how important it is in your periodization. That's why this should only be a handful of characteristics, really.
Yeah.
So
if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority.
Exactly. So goal, understanding or having an idea, because nobody can have a better idea of what is going to take than you in the end. Like asking somebody else, that's fine to maybe get a second opinion, but in the end you have to really own and understand and believe in what the requirements are. And then it's about making the assessment of where the gaps are. This gives again the periodization. When you know now where do I need to put different things into my plan here, this is when you can start to build a program and work on models that you think are the optimal ones to really address these different characteristics, depending on how far or how close you are to the race.
Yep, that's crystal clear, super helpful. Thank you. On this, and it's a very similar sort of note, we had a question from some of our previous discussions. We talked about different power profiles, and we're going to do as a teaser for what's coming in the season, we're going to do a sort of worked example of different profiles, right? A very vertical or steep profile, and a very flat profile or horizontal profile. But can you give an idea of these profiles? We talked previous series, we sort of used a 5, 20, and 60 minute as an example, power durations or speed durations. Can you give an idea of proportions that are, I guess, I don't want to use the terms good and bad, but I think we have to. So maybe optimal or suboptimal across, say, Olympic distance, half Ironman and Ironman. And the reason I include Olympic distance is because I think it'll be illustrative. I think the Ironman and half Ironman are going to be very similar. So I think the Olympic distance would be very different. So can you give an idea of those, just so that listeners can, I guess, when they're thinking about some of the stuff we talked about previously about this, I'm going to go do a profile, and they need to understand, I guess, where they are and where they'd like to be. So is there any, I guess, could you shed any light on a rough idea?
Yes, I think you would be surprised, but actually, Olympic and a half Ironman are closer to each other than basically half Ironman and Ironman is to each other, and
Yep.
it also comes down to that actually a half Ironman distance actually is something that you can encompass actually fairly good in most of your training sessions a day. It's 1900-meter swim, and that you will do in, let's say, most of the swims, even for, I would say, amateurs. They are normally getting more than 2K in the pool every day.
Yep.
4K, then you're getting a little bit more into the elite domain. So for some people that you're not that often really touching up on 4K in the pool, or 3.8K. But then you have the cycling 90K. That's a fairly okay ride for even an amateur. You don't have to be an elite to do that. 180K. Then this is starting now to get a fairly big ride again for
Big
even
day.
even for an elite. And then you have the running, which is the most crazy one, like in Ironman. But running a half marathon, that's something actually we do even in the Olympic training. Even in Olympic training, if you take both, including the warm up and the cool down, plus the sets in between there, we are getting fairly close to the half Ironman distance, or actually even encompassing a little bit quite frequently, I would say. So
And we see the success in T100 of the Olympic athletes, right? Stepping up and succeeding, even post Olympics, right? The likes of Julie Duron as a good example of someone who stepped up and been very successful very quickly. So it's a point well made. But
yeah,
continue on. Sorry.
So I would say that in terms of utilization, you are looking at, if you took, we will come more back to, let's say, this, because this is about practicalities. Because the problem is that to get people to do an all out. So if you had let's say if you had a VO2 master, this is fairly simple. This is very, very simple, because basically what you can do now, you can do a couple of different intensities versus your max, and you will actually just look at the utilization versus your max. That's it. That's simple, and also combined with SMO2. But and you don't have to do brute force testing. But let's say if you were doing a critical pace or critical power profile, so meaning that you would need some shorter duration versus longer duration to assess this. The difficulty with this is that, yes, shorter duration is fairly easy for most people to just go out and they hammer it out. But asking somebody to do a 60-minute all out, that's you can always argue how easy is it to pace yourself for an all out for 60 minutes. Most likely you're gonna either overpace yourself, underpace yourself, and it becomes more variation within, let's say, those 60 minutes. But you don't need a 5 and 60 minute. You can also do shorter durations, because normally this will follow the same function. It will follow the same curve. It is just that if you, theoretically speaking, were able to have a 60-minute all out and a 5-minute all out, you would have more information available in the 60-minute all out than you would be able to do in a 15-minute all out or a 10-minute all out, for example, like that. Like, you're not able to get the effect really of temperature buildup in your body, which will be a problem at 60 minutes, but really will not be a problem at 15 minutes, for example. You will not have other factors of fatigue, whether it's mental, whether it's physical kinds of fatigue in the same way into a 15-minute part as you would do into a 60-minute part. But again, they follow normally the same function and with some variation, but we could call them either as variation or noise or whatever that are natural variations occurring there. But let's say that if you took 5 and 60-minute power and you were looking at the ratio between the two, I would normally say that you are aiming for at least for an Ironman, that your 60-minute power sits in around maybe 85% of your, or maybe even higher, but let's say 85% of your 5-minute power. If it were shorter durations, then you would normally aim, let's say, where it's closer to 80% of your 5-minute power, for example. But we'll come back and use much more practical numbers and much more practical tests in the upcoming episodes, because I know you have planned that this is exactly some of the topics we will be looking at, like where we break down exactly a more vertical kind of profile versus a more horizontal kind of profile, and how do we bridge this then into the program, and what kind of ratios would be looking at there. But that's one. The other part, the way you can do this to be more concrete already at this episode, is where you rather just operate with deltas. So you would then just look at the absolute number, but actually how the 5 versus or shorter duration power changes compared to our medium duration power. So let's say that if you did, doesn't really matter whether it's a 3-minute power and a 10-minute power, or if it's a 5-minute power and a 15-minute power, or 5 and a 10-minute power. Ideally, it would be 3 point, because it adds a little bit more robustness to the curve. The more points you have, the better, but keep it practical. It's not about testing in the end. It's about doing good training and just see how things are changing. But where even what you would be looking at is that, let's say that you already have done this. You do a race and you see, I'm not able to sustain the same kind of, I'm super good at the climbs, can keep up with everybody that is there, but on the longer, I'm not able to keep up the same pace as, let's say, my peers when it really gets longer out into the race. This is where you can say then, well, okay, let's see then in the next round now, I'm going to maintain my short duration power. So let's say that was my 5-minute power. And what you're really doing now is in your training, when you reassess it, let's say in a month's time, to see that your 15-minute power gets up higher versus your 5-minute power. That will already indicate that you indicate that you have improved your utilization, and this is where you're trying to nail in the ratio. Where should this ratio between the 5 and 15-minute power be? The problem with throwing out an absolute number for this is that this will be different depending on how many hours or the volume of training you're putting into your training program. If you put in the hours that Christian Gustav can put in, then you have a much larger range to play with, and depending on strategy, the less hour you have available, you need to pivot it into a more perfect curve and a much narrower band than what you can as an elite. So to give an example, Christian could probably get away with a lower or poorer ratio between his 5 and 60-minute power, for example, or in terms of utilization, than, for example, what an amateur could do, which had to push it much higher up, which gives it less room for, let's say, playing out different scenarios as well. So you could say that purely the fitter you get, the more room you have you can encompass a couple of more scenarios. While if you're not as fit, then you have to really try to narrow down. Okay, if I want to have a chance at the podium, or if I want to be a top 10 here, have a chance at top 10, I really need to think that, okay, of all the different scenarios I think here, I think this is the most likely one, and you try to narrow in a profile that targets that. But
yeah.
That's how you would go very systematic about it in the end, and tune this.
Yeah, and so previously we talked about growing a curve, which is everything getting bigger, right? And so with more volume, as Christian and Gustav you have a bigger curve, right? It has grown. And as a result, it's a little bit, you've got more capacity to play around, as you've sort of mentioned. Whereas if your curve is smaller, you don't have that same thing. And I guess this was illustrated, at least to me, by Christian in Frankfurt, right? Like he didn't really have to do much specific work towards that, and ran an amazing marathon, right? Regardless of the rest of the race, the marathon was the thing that was really interesting because it was so fast and he'd done so little longer work. He doesn't need to, right? And you've talked already about the marathon is probably the biggest outlier in terms of the training, particularly in difference probably between an Olympic distance and an Ironman, because you need to develop that load tolerance, and you can cycle 180 Ks. They don't do that, but the difference between not having done that and stepping up to that is much different to only running a half marathon and stepping up to a marathon from a durability component, sure.
But that's also where we could say that for Paris as well. Paris, where like swim course in Paris, we knew from the very beginning this is not a swim course that necessarily is good for the Norwegians, to put it that way, because we normally have not been the fastest in the swimming, let's say the swimming. Yeah. And then you know that, okay, the course in Paris as well is a TT course to a very large extent. It's not a very technical course. It's going to go at high pace and so on, meaning that if you want to bridge up the gap that is between, let's say, a first group and a second group, it's going to cost much more power. If it's a technical race, then basically you get more speed and velocity out of every power you put into the pedals. The higher the average speed goes for the course, now every power that you're going to put in, because the pace is already quite high, is going to cost a large portion for that. That was actually the strategy, like moving into Bermuda, for example. We corkscrew, this was in 2018 when we had both Christian Gustav and Kasper on the podium. Went up corkscrew hill there, very steep hill. We knew that if they went with hard power, nobody's going to go in a breakaway up the hill there. But if they just keep it up the top there, they go, let's say, hard enough. They keep control. They just have to make sure they come into corkscrew in the lead. then you can go up there. If there now opens up a gap there, we know that if they just continue that power, because if you exhaust you too much yourself now, you're going to start resting going downhill. But if you just keep up this power, so you stay basically racing now 380 watts, something like that, 400 watts, keep around LT2 going downhill there. If there now is a gap there of 10 seconds, you want to catch up with somebody that's pushing 400 watts, or let's say 350 watts comfortably down that hill there. It means basically even to catch up a gap there of 5 to 10 seconds means you need to put out 650 watts, and not for 5 to 10 seconds to bridge up that gap, because the guy in the front is moving as well. So it's going to take you minutes to basically close the gap that is there, and that means basically already you can just forget it, because you're going to blow up even trying to get there. So you need to rather try to bridge the gap other places in the course, unless somebody sits in front and they push fairly. They're trying to keep up the distance well. Paris, this is a place where average speed was really high. You can just look at the times that basically was for the bike part of the race there. Meaning again also that if there's already is a gap there, it means it's going to cost a lot for people to really bridge up the gap that is there, and that will also then dictate normally that you said, okay, that means I need to keep a higher average power output and less basically stochastic racing. That will also then say that, well, naturally you need to then, I would say, bring up your utilization. But the danger of that is when you bring up the utilization, you're also still burning. You optimize things, but it also means you're also bleeding a little bit off on the top speed as well when you get out on the run part in the end of the race too. So it's Christian then coming into Frankfurt. Yes, he already has a good utilization as a result of the training that led into Paris. And you see basically, he doesn't have to do Ironman training when he has the capacity he has, and also his utilization already have been brought up, and then he can get quite a lot for free there without doing a lot of specialization. But obviously with more specialization he could have gone faster. But again, it just like comes back to the point that you basically, his capacity leaves him more room to play different scenarios from short to long course. While if you have less capacity, it means basically you just have to aim exactly for what you're racing for, and maybe one or two scenarios is what you can build into your program.
Yeah, the last one I wanted to touch on was, and it relates to our proportions that we sort of just touched on, which is how do you know if you're in shape too early, and how do you course correct? Right, so
if you already have probably done some racing, you've probably done several races already, you've done several blocks of training before and so on. So it means already that you have an idea of probably that this is a block where I put in a lot of training and it was close to the maximum. I don't think I could have built very much more in. Of course, you can do two things now. Try to be a little bit smarter about it to see how you can build a little bit more load into the program there. But that already gives you a sense of where you have to build towards next season, for example, or this season, depending on what you're looking at. What you really are trying to do is that to get there and then maybe a little bit more for a short period that you can call it survive with good quality. That's the key word, good quality. And then you release and you get that shape building there. If you're already getting to that point too early in the season, you're bringing on too much load and other things, and you need to take extra rest days or other things like this, unplanned rest days, you get sickness as a function of your load and other things like this, then you are peaking too early in the season. It is really purely a function of what can you sustain over years in terms of training, what can you sustain over shorter periods of training, and then building in exactly what you can sustain for a shorter period of time at the peak in your block, so that you have, when you start tapering, it's just before you really would almost be forced to need it, brute force, put it that way. I'm not sure. It is written so many books on this that it is, on the one side, it is a complicated topic, but it's not that complicated when you also understand this.
I think the other thing to note, if you're a young athlete, and we do have some young listeners, is don't get greedy with it. Like the fundament on which everything sits is consistency. So, if you add a new peak load and your coach wants to deload you and you're still feeling good, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Deload for a little bit and then come back, because ultimately the goal is years down the track. It's not in months. No matter how important you think that next competition is, the most important competition is years away for you if you want to be a successful athlete.
Yeah, and I think then also what I would say normally there, if you need to deload, so you put in suddenly a deload, an unplanned deload, I would say that that's where I would say that then you have room for optimization for, let's say, later on. Because I would rather say that I would call it the optimal way would be almost where you rather put in stabilization instead. So you would come up and then rather you say, okay, we put in a little bit of stabilization here now instead before we start continuing to build instead. The moment you need to deload, you will actually get an involuntarily, let's say, taper. It acts a little bit as a taper or to get a little bit of surplus. But then you can also say that there's a lot of practical training periods. So let's say you have a 4-week periodization or 3-week periodization. The whole point, obviously, with this is to use 1 week to absorb a little bit, give room for absorption, so you get ready for the next mesocycle that you put in there or next block that you put in there. But in general, you're still looking to build every of these blocks on top of each other. And if you need to suddenly plan with deloading, a little bit of deloading, yes, then do at least control deloading. But in the ideal scenario, it would be where you can say, okay, if you call it deloading or absorption or whatever, and it's already planned that you do it there, that's good. That's where you want to be. You want to be in a place where you see that, okay, we know there's going to be deloading in 3 weeks' time or something. We're going to bring down the volume a little bit in that part, or let's say the intensity a little bit there, to absorb now quite a lot of load that is here, and you get used to these kind of cycles. But uncontrolled deloading, or basically where you need to schedule, let's say, now some deloading into the program, then you've come to the point where you probably went a little bit too greedy already there in your programming. But I would rather say that I would rather want an athlete and a coach that maybe is a little bit too greedy, and then they learn quickly moving forward, than always say, oh, we need to be very controlled, because that's going to take longer time to learn where maybe things are. But then again, going too crazy, it's an optimum. Then it is complicated, and there are many things here
it's difficult to talk in generalizations, but I think that to sum it up, intelligent failures. You want to be making intelligent failures, not stupid failures, right? So don't break yourself, but certainly be dare to experiment, as you said before. So that's it for another episode of the Norwegian Method podcast. Thank you so much to all the listeners. Please do subscribe if you haven't. We do have many episodes coming this season. As I said, we have Olav joining us many more times. We have Christian and Gustav joining us. So subscribe if you haven't. Please share this episode with people that you think would enjoy it. And of course, please rate the podcast. It is greatly helpful to us. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, David.
The Norwegian Method.